Hello, everyone. Welcome to the after lunch sessions. I hope it won't be too sleepy after lunch. This is the DDoS presentation, and I always struggle to talk about DDoS because many people mean very different things when they talk about DDoS. So some people mean their slow Ruby app, which cannot handle 5 concurrent users. No, that's DDoS. That does DDoS to some, absolutely. So this is not what this talk is going to be about. More specifically, I'm going to focus on the nitty-gritty technical details of pretty low-level attacks that we see, which I believe are particularly dangerous. Okay, so let me first give you a quick roadmap of this talk. Maybe that will help to follow it through. First, I'll introduce the denial of service attacks, or distributed denial of service attacks, which are the attacks on the internet, which consists of multiple machines attacking some servers in order to take them down, to disrupt their services. Then I'll try to convince you that the really big attacks, the really big threat to the internet infrastructure, is caused by IP spoofing, and that IP spoofing is behind all of these major things. IP spoofing is basically faking the IP addresses in the packets. Then I'll go to conclude that the IP spoofing enables untraceable and sophisticated attacks, which is pretty bad, and that leads to centralization in the internet. That's not the only force in the internet that leads to centralization, but I believe that's one of the important ones. And finally, I hope I'll be able to present you the solution, like what should we do about it? How can we, as the internet community and participants on the internet, actually solve the problem long term? Let's start by explaining DDoS and explaining kind of where they come from. So my name is Marek, and I work for a performance and security company called CloudFlare. And at CloudFlare, we operate a globally distributed reverse proxy. We have plenty of servers around the world. I think our count of points of presence is right now 86, so we are pretty much in every major city on the globe. We have plenty of customers from all different backgrounds, different places in the world, from government agencies to dating portals. But what's most important, we are trying to be content neutral. We try not to discriminate customers based on what they do, what content they have. And this leads to issues, because if you are operating in the internet these days, and if you have any kind of serious scale, then you will be attacked. Some people dislike some content, they try to take it down, and they do it by launching DDoS attacks. And we see that all the time. We are the middlemen, we receive these attacks on our side. So on this chart, you can see daily attacks that we've seen over the last 90 days. On the y-axis, you can see just daily attacks, like one kind of spike per day, and timeline on the x-axis. So as you can see, in most of the days, it was quite quiet, between 50 and 200 attacks per day. But on some days, we were very busy with up to 1,000 or a bit more than 1,000 attacks per day. So this is a serious problem. The attacks happen to us all the time. And we don't fight the attacks because we like it. It's because we have to do it. In order to keep our customers' websites online, we have to be able to survive the attacks of very different kinds, very different natures. But we don't take any particular pleasure from serving these attacks, from handling these. This is a distraction to us. This is not what we choose to do. We have to do it. So long term, we would like to contribute to actually solve the DDoS problem in the internet. Okay, so over the years, we've accumulated a number of kind of record-breaking attacks that you may or may not have heard from news. If you've heard about like spam house attack, which was dubbed also as the attack that almost broke the internet, things like that. So basically, headline-grabbing attacks. So in this talk, I'll go over 3 types of attacks that we've seen over the years. If you don't know the names here on this table, don't worry, I'll explain that. But it's important to emphasize that these attacks don't kind of come out of the blue. They are not like random things that happen just because someone invented something. They always, these big headline-grabbing attacks have 2 things in common. They always have 2 things in common. One is they are big, and if they are big, it means they consist of many IP packets. These are usually kind of layer 3 attacks, so basically it is just stray packets hitting the server. You cannot generate, or maybe differently, it's very hard to generate a really big attack if you are doing that on kind of HTTP layer. So most of the big, if not all of the big kind of record-breaking attacks are just kind of packets hitting the servers. So it's just a big number of sheer IP packets. It's not uncommon for us to see situations when only one in about 10,000 packets that we receive is valid. All the other packets are just belonging to the attack. This is pretty common. So you can imagine the scale. And the second thing that these attacks have in common is that they all consist of IP spoofing. In each and every single case of these, the attacker was able to do IP spoofing. So again, it's important to understand that this is kind of the cause. So what is IP spoofing? So IP spoofing is a fairly easy thing to grasp. So in the internet, the data is chunked into packets, and they are transmitted as packets over the internet. And the idea of IP spoofing is to basically rewrite the source IP address of the packet. Packets are just series of bytes. You can stick whatever you want inside the packets. It's the bytes that you transmit. It's your bytes, like bigger, anything you choose. And IP spoofing is exactly about rewriting the source IP address. And this is pretty bad. It's pretty bad because it can confuse the destination. So on the receiving side, if you receive packets, basically on the internet, there is no way to figure out whether the packet that you received is actually coming from the host that is in the source IP address, or is it coming from someone else who is just faking this packet, who is just spoofing it. And this is pretty bad because this enables impersonation on the internet. In kind of the history of the internet, it was recognized fairly early on that this is a problem, that this can cause attacks, that this is problematic. And in May 2000, so 16 years ago, there was a famous document published called BCP38. BCP is like RFC, but a bit less formal. So kind of RFC published, which basically said, guys, on the internet, we have this big problem. People are faking the IP addresses. People are sending spoofed traffic. We have to fix that because this can grow. This can actually become a real issue. And the internet community kind of had this document, had the guidelines for years. And as for now, according to spoofer.kai.org project, it's still about 25 to 27% of networks on the internet that do allow IP spoofing. So in the developed world, it is most likely that your network does not allow IP spoofing. In the US and Europe, most networks don't do that. But in the world overall, according to this project, about 25 to 27% of networks still do allow their customers to basically send arbitrary packets to the internet. So you may ask, okay, why this wasn't fixed? Why this last quarter of networks on the internet haven't fixed the issue? What was so hard about that? And unfortunately, this is kind of a typical tragedy of the commons thing. It's like if there is one network on the internet that does allow IP spoofing, there is little incentive for the others to fix that. And moreover, fixing IP spoofing requires active action from the ISPs. Unfortunately, the only way to stop IP spoofing is to do it very, very close to the source, to the device that actually transmits the packets. So if you have a DSL, the IP spoofing filtering will be done close to your machines, on your DSL modem or on the closest router. If you're operating in the server room, it's most likely that the closest switch or the closest router will actually be able to do the filtering and forbid you from doing IP spoofing. The internet is created in such a way that it's very hard, almost impossible, to filter spoofed IP addresses within kind of the internet backbone. So basically, the only place to do that is close to the source. Okay, so I explained that IP spoofing enables impersonation, which is pretty nasty. And then I said that it is still not a solved problem, even though IP spoofing is in the internet history for years, 20 years, since the beginning. It's still there. We still haven't fixed the problem totally. Okay, so let's move on to the main two kind of subjects of this talk, which is that tracing back the IP addresses, the attacks, is impossible if they have spoofed IP addresses, and then that the IP spoofing allows sophisticated attacks. Okay, so the first point: why do I say that tracing back the attacks is impossible? I would like to show that on an example. So let's say that CloudFlare is being attacked. Let's say that we are being attacked. What do we do? What is the procedure that we do in order to understand who is attacking us, who is behind it, who is transmitting these packets? Okay, so what do is we look at the attack. We see, okay, there is something weird going on. It's usually in some charts. This is a chart of number of received packets per second. And this is a per server chart, and this server usually received, I think, 50,000 packets per second. And during the attack, it jumped to 400,000 packets per second. So clearly something happened. Clearly big attack is happening. So what we do is we try to identify what is inside these packets. We log in onto the machine. We run TCP dump, Julia's favorite tool. And we look at the packets. We try to identify them. In this case, it was a Synflood, so TCP packets with syn bit set. And if you look at the IP addresses, they will look pretty random, because most likely the source IP addresses actually are random. Okay, so having this data, what do we do next? How can we react? How can we stop the attackers? So generally, we need to identify where the attack comes from, on which of the cables, on which of the physical wires the attack is coming to our network. So we need to log into our router and look at some charts and investigate the charts and figure out, okay, on which of the cables the attack is originating from. In this case, it's the bottom left chart, which you may or may not see the big spikes of inbound traffic. It's like it usually was quite flat, and then the spike went up to 10 gigs. So basically, it filled the pipe for 2 short moments. Okay, so this most likely the source of the attack. So who is on the other side of this cable? Who actually, where is this cable on the router connected to? And generally, we have 3 types of connectivities. We have 3 categories of cables on our routers. So the attack could have come from 3 different kind of places. So one is what is called direct peering, or also called PNIs, which is basically a wire that goes between our router to some other router on the internet, which belongs to like another entity on the internet. It's usually a big entity like, let's say, Amazon or Google or Linode or DigitalOcean, some kind of other big internet player. The other type of cables that we have connected to our routers goes to local internet exchanges. Local internet exchanges are things that are switches, which basically are a community of local ISPs. So this is kind of localized traffic, usually local to a major city or a major hub. And finally, there is the internet transit or internet carriers type of connectivity, which is a paid-for service. You cannot reach the internet over direct peering or internet exchanges. So in order to reach the internet, you have to pay for that. And that's the kind of internet carrier traffic. OK, so let's imagine that the attack was coming from direct peering. So what do we do in such a case? This is the easiest case, because what do is we know exactly where it was coming from. It was coming from the guy on the other side of the cable. There's no other entity involved. Usually they don't allow kind of third-party internet entities to send traffic over this cable. So it's pretty simple. So we pick up the phone and we say, guys, you're sending us malicious traffic. Can you please fix your problem? And this usually works. We usually have direct connectivity only to rational and technically competent parties on the internet. And it's in the interest of both parties to fix the problem. It's usually a misconfiguration. For example, Amazon has a very good policy, and it's very nice to work with Amazon. They close the attacks very quickly. OK, so what in the other remaining two situations? So what if the attack was coming from an internet exchange, or what it was coming from the internet carrier? What do we do in such a case? Unfortunately, there is not much we can do. This is pretty bad, and let me explain. So I first need to say what an internet exchange is. Internet exchange is basically a layer 2 Ethernet switch. It's like big, very big, fancy switch, which is usually in a big data center in a major city. So this is a pretty picture of, I think, Seattle's internet exchange. So you can see a big switch and plenty of cables going out of it. And what's connected to those cables is other people's routers. So basically, it's a switch connecting routers. And these routers mostly belong to local ISPs. So if we see attack coming from an internet exchange, from our router point of view, it would be a spike on this cable connected to the internet exchange. And unfortunately, that's it. Unfortunately, we cannot recognize who actually is sending the packets. We don't have much better visibility. This is because routers operate on the IP layer, so they look at the IP frame and up, and there is not any data like who actually sent this IP frame on IP layer. If you look carefully, this data, like who actually originated this packet, is available. It's in the Ethernet frame, so it's lower layer. But unfortunately, the normal routers, the major vendor routers, cannot really inspect Ethernet frames. So basically, you have no visibility whatsoever. So all we know is, yep, the attack came from this internet exchange. That's it. We don't know. We don't have any much data. That's pretty sad. Okay, what about internet carriers? What if the attack is coming from kind of the real internet? Maybe they can help us. Maybe they can help us identifying the attack source. So let me give you an example. So in March this year, we published a story called Winter of Attacks. It was pretty nice, pretty fancy pattern of attacks that was hitting us every, I think, weekend. And we published this particular chart. This chart shows gigabits per second flowing to over one of our cables. It was a pretty big cable. It was a 100 gigabit link, and the attack reached about 80 gigabits per second. So it was a pretty sizable attack just going over one cable. So as you can imagine, this cable was in this case was connected to an internet carrier, to our paid-for service that we pay to deliver traffic. But what we knew more is that the source IP addresses of this particular attack were coming from Hurricane Electric. Hurricane Electric is another big internet provider. Okay, so it was Hurricane Electric attacking us, as simple as that? Well, no, and we are actually fairly confident about that. We are confident because actually we have direct connectivity to Hurricane Electric in this very data center. So basically, this router has direct cable going to Hurricane Electric. So there is no way the attack could have actually originated from Hurricane Electric. So we are pretty confident the attack was coming from some customer of our internet carrier. So we called them up and said, guys, one of your customers is spoofing IP traffic, is sending us 80 gigabits of junk. Can you please fix that? And their answer is actually no. It's no for two reasons. One is that they cannot actually preemptively know that the attack is spoofed. From their point of view, it's Hurricane Electric packets. It's like legitimate traffic. Maybe it was actually Hurricane Electric. They don't know that we have this connection on our side. They don't have to know. And the other thing is that they actually don't have good visibility into their network. So basically, they do not know over which cable, from which customer this traffic was originated from. So that's pretty sad. And that leads to the conclusion that if the attack is with spoofed IP addresses, basically there is no way to attribute the attack. There is no way to trace back who actually is behind it. Okay, so let's go to the second major point of this talk, which is that IP spoofing allows fairly sophisticated attacks. I'll show you three examples of sophisticated attacks. I'll show you the spam house attack, then we'll go back to the winter of attacks, which I mentioned already, and finally I'll speak about kind of the new trend, the direct subnet attacks. Okay, so let's start with the spam house attacks. So what they were is they were amplification attacks. So what is an amplification attack? What is this category of attacks? So imagine an UDP server and UDP client, like, for example, a DNS server or maybe an NTP server. I think MySQL also has some UDP backends. Anyway, kind of simple request-response UDP-based protocol. So you send a request, and the server answers with some response. For example, the request could be to a DNS server, give me the resolution of google.com, and the server politely responds, here's your IP address, here's the resolution. So this is kind of how UDP request-response works. The idea of amplification is that the attacker fakes the requests. So fakes the request and convinces the server to give the answer to the target. Okay, so far so good. So basically the server will receive the request, which is fake, and politely answer to the target, to the third party. Okay, so why is that interesting? It's interesting because in many of the UDP request-response protocols, the response is way larger than the request. So this allows you to basically magnify the attack. So if the attacker has, say, 1 gigabit of capacity, then by kind of bouncing off of these UDP servers, the attacker can generate much bigger bandwidth, and let's say 10 times more than it has. Obviously, bouncing off a single UDP server will not be very good. Single UDP servers don't do good traffic, don't do big traffic. But if you distribute the attack against 10,000 of open servers on the internet, you can generate quite substantial load. And this is exactly what happened in 2013 with the spam house attacks. When we estimate that the attackers had only about 30 gigabits of capacity, they had access to 3 machines with 10 gigabits cables, and they were able to bounce off open exposed DNS resolvers and basically generate 300 gigabits of traffic going to our servers. So pretty substantial load. I'll argue that this is not the biggest threat in today's internet. Still, amplification exists. These attacks are still fairly popular, and they can be pretty unpleasant to smaller providers. But I'll argue that they're at least fairly easy to block. If you receive some unwanted DNS traffic, well, it's like simple firewall rule to fix that. That's not that bad. And also the internet community tries to proactively fix the problem. They try to close down the servers that could be used for amplification. So there is the openresolverproject.org, which tracks down the DNS servers. There is openntpproject.org, which tracks down the open NTP servers. And then there is Shodan.io database, which is very helpful to find these things. So basically, we try to close down the amplification. OK, let's move on to the next one. So let's go back to the winter of attacks history from earlier this year. It was a different type of attack. It was a different pattern. In this case, we received packets directly. There was no bouncing of any amplification. The packets went straight from the attacker over the public internet to our servers. OK? They were pretty big, so the attackers were able to generate 400 gigabits of load. And at the bottom chart, you can see that at peak, it was about 400 gigs. And at the top, you can see number of packets per second received, which tops at about 150 million packets per second. So you can imagine what would happen to your server if it was flooded with 150 million packets per second. It would most likely boil. So in this case, as I mentioned, the packets were sent directly without any amplification in the middle. And that means that the attacker was able to generate any packet they wanted. They could pick and choose. They weren't bound to using DNS or NTP or anything else. They could pick any packets they wanted. So what they did is they basically attacked us with Synflood. And Synfloods are pretty nasty to defend, because you cannot just drop on the firewall all the SYN packets that you receive. And because this will deny the services, because SYN packets are part of TCP handshake. And basically, you need, in order to have TCP connections going to your servers, you need to receive the SYN packets. So how did we defend that? How are we surviving that? Well, we found the BPF feature on IP tables, on Linux firewall, to be extremely efficient and extremely effective against this type of attack. So what is BPFs? So here you can see an IP tables example, and BPF is these numbers in the middle. What are those numbers? What can they do? Well, these numbers can be decompiled to kind of more like assembly code. And these numbers can basically represent a program. So you can run a program inside the firewall, inside IP tables, and this is extremely effective. In this program, you can do deep packet inspection, and you can look very deep into the packet and figure out whether the packet is valid or whether it belongs to the attack. And you have full programmability there. So it is really, really, really good. We published our tools open source. So there is a GitHub project, BPF tools, and there are a couple of scripts to generate BPFs for both DNS attacks and Synfloods. So maybe that would be useful for you. OK, so I already mentioned that on this attack, the source IP addresses belonged to Hurricane Electric, and that we believe they were spoofed. How about different attacks? Maybe you can tell something exciting about different attacks, patterns, and different attacks, source IP addresses. What is in the source IP addresses? So in order to explain that, I need to first show you the XKCD from 2006, in which Randall tried to attempt to draw a map of the internet. So this basically shows all the IP addresses on the internet drawn on a two-dimensional space. Fairly nice eye candy. The feature of this particular type of graph, which is called Hilbert curve, is that the IP addresses which are close by will be close by on this two-dimensional space. OK, it looks pretty nice. So what did we see? What attacks do we see? This is one of the examples of the source IP addresses that we saw. So every black pixel here represents a packet with source IP address belonging to this particular subnet. OK, so this looks like some distribution. OK, we got some packets. Why do we claim they were spoofed? How do we know they were spoofed? We actually don't. But what we do know is that this is the pattern of all IP addresses belonging to China Telecom. Once again, this is the attack. This is China Telecom. This is the attack. This is China Telecom. OK, but the conclusions are actually not obvious. So there are two ways to interpret that. One way is that someone has a very big botnet of physical machines, doesn't do any IP spoofing, and just have big botnet. By the way, this big botnet is in every single net block belonging to this particular provider. This is possible. I don't know that. And the other option is that someone was just going over the IP ranges of this particular provider and just spoofing them with fairly uniform distribution. OK, how about different patterns? Maybe there is something more exciting here. This is my favorite one, in which the attackers just went uniformly across the whole IP space from IP address 0000 to 255. And if you see here also the kind of the hashed out blocks which are reserved are also here. So if you ask us, do we receive attacks from localhost? Absolutely. Every couple of days, Every place our local host attacks us, or someone from our local host. There are a couple of different patterns that we see. This is a bit more sane. In this case, the reserved blocks are not used part of the attack. But what's the interpretation? Were the attackers smarter? We don't know. Maybe it's their ISP that was blocking the unroutable IP addresses. OK, let's go for next one. Yet a different pattern. Why this pattern? I have no idea. And let's go to the final one. This is particularly interesting. It may look like an attack launched from a couple of very big ISPs, which has net blocks all around the world, or maybe some European IP addresses. No. What this is the exact opposite of the internet map. So this basically shows the IP addresses belonging to, the IP addresses which are not routable. So basically, someone looked at the IP addresses that are routable in the world, that actually exist in the world, and inverted them and looked only for IP addresses that are not routable and spoofed only these. So this is a fairly sophisticated effort to only create attacks from IP addresses which don't actually exist. OK, so let's go to the final attack example, which I call direct subnet. This is a fairly new thing that we encountered only in June this year. So in order to explain why this is dangerous, why this is worth talking about, I need to first tell you what are the usual mitigation techniques for really big attacks. If you receive a really big attack, and if it congests the network, unfortunately, your network will be unavailable because normal packets will not be able to fit in the pipe. So the usual mitigation technique that pretty much everyone uses is to remove the attacked IP address from the internet. You can do that via BGP null routing, sometimes called BGP blackholing. The idea is that you use BGP, the kind of router protocol, to tell to your ISP, by the way, this single IP address, it receives attack. Please don't send any packets to this IP address to me. Like, forget about this IP address. This is very effective. Obviously, this IP address will not be available. But at least the other IP addresses, your other servers, will be available. If you want to keep your services online during null routing, you need to use DNS to point your legitimate customers to different IP addresses. OK, so what attack did we see? Well, we saw attack against not a single IP address or a couple of these, but against the whole subnet, against the whole 255 IP addresses at once, uniformly distributed. This was a pretty big attack. And it's particularly nasty because that means that the usual technique of BGP null routing will not work. It will not be effective against this attack. You cannot do it technically. You cannot technically null route 255 IP addresses. And also, you actually don't want to lose that many IP addresses at once. So this is pretty nasty. And unfortunately, this leads to the conclusion that the only way to defend, to keep online during such big attacks, is to absorb them, is to have enough capacity to not cause congestion, and to be able to actually receive the packets. This is called scrubbing in the DDoS world. And the idea is that basically you have very, very, very fat pipes, more than 400 gigabits of pipes, and plenty of servers capable of filtering the traffic. Unfortunately, not many people can afford that. So everyone that is serious about having good uptime in the internet, I would say that means pretty much everyone, everyone needs to use kind of third-party DDoS mitigation services just because they usually cannot afford to have their own mitigation stack, their own expensive hardware and expensive bandwidth. And this causes centralization. It means that there are only a couple of big DDoS mitigation providers that can afford the bandwidth and the hardware. And this is pretty bad. This is pretty bad because it means that these mitigation providers have very big leverage in the internet. And it also kind of erodes the principles of the internet. Internet was created as a collection of equal peers. Everyone could, if you were connected to the internet, you had an IP address, you could have a server, you could consume content, you could talk to anyone, everyone was equal. It was very democratic. It's not possible anymore. It's not possible because in order to exist with good uptime, you need to hide behind DDoS mitigation services. OK, so what's the solution? How can the internet community long-term fix the problem? What can we do about it? So first, we need to understand that I think that the technical solutions to IP spoofing are kind of done. I think we cannot do much more about that. And basically, technical solutions to IP spoofing failed. So we need to learn how to live with IP spoofing. We need to just understand that you cannot use source IP addresses for attribution. Source IP addresses will almost always not be a good evidence because they just could be spoofed. So we need to figure out how to identify the attackers, how to identify the attack sources without looking at the source IP addresses. As simple as that. So basically, let's not focus on solving the IP spoofing. We tried that, the internet community tried that for the last 20 years. we should now try something different. We should try to solve the attribution. We should try to be able to actually trace back the attack. So what I'm proposing is that we should ask our internet exchanges to help us. If there's an attack going over an internet exchange, maybe they can identify who actually sent the packets, where the traffic originated, which of the local ISPs actually transmitted the packets. And for internet carriers, the same story. Maybe the internet carriers should help us out and figure out which of their customers sent the traffic. And the big question is how the ISPs, how the internet exchanges and internet carriers can actually do that. It's technically fairly hard to have good insight into the network. So the solution is to use NetFlow. NetFlow is a pretty nice protocol supported by all major router vendors. It's fairly easy to set up. And basically, it allows you or whoever's operating the routers to collect traces of connections in a central place. And then in this central place, you can do analytics, aggregations, and you have very good insight exactly what happened on the network. You know exactly what connections were, from where to where, with what bandwidth. And so NetFlow is very nice. There is a very good open source stack around it. It scales well, and it scales well up because you can increase or reduce the sampling rate. So basically, in NetFlow, you are specifying how much of the data should be actually logged. And you can set the sampling rate to something like 1 in 64,000 connections. So you can really log not much data. So you can have really many routers with very big bandwidth and still use NetFlow. If you are worried about the privacy concerns, that your connections will be tracked, their metadata of the connections will be monitored, yes. On the other hand, the probability that your connection will actually be tracked is very low because, as I mentioned, the sampling rate could be set to something like 1 in 64,000 connections. So I think this is kind of an acceptable risk. Furthermore, actually, we don't care about historical data at all. We only care about last 24 or 48 hours of attacks. We actually really want to identify the currently flowing attacks. So I think the privacy issues are addressed fairly well. OK, let me show you an example. So this is the NetFlow command line tool called nfdump, which is used on our servers. And it's a very simple query which answers what attack was happening over the last 5 minutes on this particular cable, on this particular router. You need to learn how to read this. It is fairly, plenty of numbers, but there are much nicer backends to actually view this data. So anyway, NetFlow contains all this data. So basically, if you are an internet carrier, please do upgrade. Please start using NetFlow. It is really important for us. OK, obviously, using NetFlow will not solve the problem. The DDoS attacks will still be there. They will still be threatening the internet. But at least we will solve the attribution. At least we will be able to have a discussion saying, OK, now we know that this attack is actually a real botnet. How can we solve that? Or now we know that the attack is actually a state actor or some data center hacked or someone else on the internet profiting from launching DDoSes. Right now, there is no discussion like that. We just don't know who is behind it. And we cannot technically know right now. So that's it. So I hope I was able to convince you that the DDoS attacks and DDoS threats are one of the forces that causes centralization in the internet, and that the only way to fix it is actually to fix DDoS. And we can fix DDoS by doing attribution right, to be able to figure out where the attacks are originated from. And if we can do the attribution, hopefully the internet will be better for everyone, not only CloudFlare, but every single participant on the internet. Thank you. Any questions? Please.
You summarized, reached the conclusion at one point, there are no concrete technical solutions. What are your other solutions that you believe, or what other solutions have you heard of that seem plausible or feasible to help you mitigate this?
So the IP spoofing, so in May 2000, the BCP38 kind of concluded that the internet community should basically actively fight IP spoofing. Unfortunately, the internet community made some progress, and over the years, 60% of ISPs do not allow IP spoofing, but there's still this percentage. The big question is, how do you convince the remaining 25% of ISPs to do something about that? I don't think you can. This requires money, this requires investment. They need to fix their configurations. They need to figure out their stuff. How do I convince them? I don't know. So at least for foreseeable future, I believe we have to assume that IP spoofing will be with us, and that basically IP addresses cannot be used for attribution. So if you are under attack, and if you have monetary damages, if you want to sue someone for the attack, who? You don't know. There's no way to find out. Does that answer the question? Please?
Does IPv6 help with this problem?
No. We don't see too many sophisticated attacks over IPv6, but technically speaking, it's the same story. There is no technical difference. Please?
What percentage of ISPs are not using that flow actively at this point? Do you have any numbers around that?
I don't know about ISPs. I do know that on the kind of big tier 1 internet carriers, internet transits, it's a fairly significant percentage. I know only about one that actually has a good network setup and is fairly fresh thing for them. The big issue is that if you're buying bandwidth from some tier 1 provider, the service you're buying is you're paying them for delivering traffic, like not to discriminate, not to do much more. That's the service you're buying. And also you pay for the stability of the service. So they're not really incentivized to upgrade to newer, Cisco iOS versions and to actually set up anything. It is in their interest because they can get better insight into their network, but that's not like historically what they were good at. So the answer is this is still a problem, and still big tier 1 providers do not do that very often. That's exactly the problem. So the question is, who has the interest in upgrading that? That's exactly the problem. So in the internet, according to my knowledge, there isn't any significant force that tries to kind of solve this issue. People see attacks, people see headlines, in news, but there isn't anyone that actually wants to solve it. The problem affects mostly big providers. So if you're a small provider, you'll quickly understand, like smaller media provider, you'll quickly understand that you need, in order to survive, in order to keep online, you need to use DDoS mitigation services, okay? Because there's no other way, you don't have technical capacity. And from the big DDoS mitigation providers that then actually receive the traffic, they usually stay silent. They usually don't really, they aren't really in this discussion because, it's a sticky point. If you cannot move off my services, that's good for business, I guess, for some. So basically, there's no single internet force in the internet that actually wants to tackle the big attacks. I want to emphasize here that this talk was only about the really big things, the really big attacks, not about smaller things. Did I answer the question?
Well, yeah. Is it on the radar of like and other
This is the backbone of the internet. This is how the internet works. I don't know if anyone actually kind of cares. Okay, any more questions? Please.
Going back to the defense against Synfloods, you talked about using bytecode for the packet filter. Can you talk a little bit at a higher level about how you decide which Syn packets are legitimate, which ones you want to throw out?
Absolutely. So the question is about BPF bytecode in IP tables. How do we actually know which packets are valid or not? I highly recommend looking at the GitHub repo. You'll find all the secret sauce there. But my claim is that, generally speaking, it is reasonably easy to distinguish packets that belong to the attack to not. This is, generally speaking. I think we can get one more question.
Is there any thought you can give into a protocol change if a router or a server is suspicious to send like a verifying message back to ask for verification that you are in fact this IP address?
The question is there a way to verify if the packets are actually originated from a real IP address? Yes, this is any stateful protocol. So basically, you need to have a handshake. You need to be, I'm here, this is my magical number. I'm here, this is my magical number. And then you're convinced that you're talking to this other guy. This is how TCP works. So basically, if you don't have this kind of trust establishment first, then the UDP protocol will most likely could be used for amplification. Good examples are DNS, which is fire forgets, so fire and quick response, and NTP. There are a couple of more like TFTP and Chargen.
Would that require a change in the IP layer?
Would that require changing IP layer? No, it's just the data. It's just how do I know that you are you? Like, how do I, like, it maybe someone sits on, like we need to have some data, some state to exchange it. Okay, one more question maybe?
You said about the attacks against subnets. Do you see more attacks around multiple subnets? Because normally CDNs providing like multiple subnets with the current role, different points of presence, like different subnets. Do you see like attacks that are global or more like regional?
The question is, do I see attacks that are more global or more regional? This goes very deeply into how my particular service is created. Depends. Some of the attacks are nicely distributed all around the world, and we see them everywhere, but then they are smaller. And some of the attacks hit only one particular data center, and then they are much more dangerous. So I showed especially the subnet attacks because I believe this is a fairly new trend, and this kind of this means that the usual mitigation techniques will not be effective. And I believe this is a fairly kind of big threat and fairly new thing on the internet, at least from what I see. So that's why it was worth emphasizing. Okay, thank you very much.